Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled All Means All, The Road to Inclusivity in Clinical Trials. My name is Aisha Rashid, and I will be your X Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Worldwide Clinical Trials who developed the content for this presentation. Worldwide Clinical Trials is a global, mid-sized contract research organization that provides top-performing bioanalytical and phase 1 to 4 clinical development services to the biotechnology and pharmaceutical industries. Their full-service clinical experience ranges from early phase and bioanalytical sciences through late phase studies, post-approval, and real-world evidence. Major therapeutic areas of focus include cardiovascular, metabolic, neuroscience, oncology, and rare diseases. Operating in more than 60 countries with offices in North and South America, Eastern and Western Europe, Russia, and Asia, Worldwide is powered by its more than 3,000 employee experts. Now, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Aman Kara is Vice President and Global Head of Regulatory Strategy at Worldwide Clinical Trials and has been providing global strategic direction in regulatory affairs for more than 2 decades. She has built her career on maintaining fastidious patient care with the pragmatism needed to help clients achieve effective global regulatory strategies. She is committed to diversity and inclusion in clinical research and advises within industry on how best to action into practical strategies. Jeff Trotter, Senior Vice President for Worldwide Evidence, supports customers with the critical transition from clinical development to commercialization. With more than 3 decades of experience and an MBA from Northwestern University, Jeff brings a pioneering spirit to the evolving real-world evidence research landscape. He prioritizes personalized client service, practical guidance based in experience, and candid communications grounded in mutual respect and cultural sensitivity through his role at Worldwide. Sean Tretna is an Associate Director within the Patient Recruitment and Retention Department at Worldwide Clinical Trials, with over 15 years of experience working on strategies that ultimately increase clinical trial awareness to those interested in learning more about treatment options available to them. Sean specializes in thinking outside the box and determining cost-effective strategies that contribute to the well-being of all involved when conducting a clinical research study. Allison Kemner is the Vice President of Clinical Sciences and Operations at Tira Biosciences. Her formative educational years were spent in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where she developed a deep understanding of the intersection of social structures, healthcare, and access barriers. Her educational and professional experiences fueled her focus on clinical trial access. She is a passionate leader whose efforts target aggressive measures that both broaden inclusivity and augment diversity with the ultimate aim to improve patient outcomes. And now, without further ado, I'd like to pass over the mic and screen share control to our speakers. You may begin when ready.
Great. Thank you so much, Aisha. Really appreciate that. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, no matter where you are. And we wanted to start this off about thinking about the different intersections of how we need to manage and what we need to be doing for, diversity and inclusion in clinical research. And that really does speak about a lot about how all means all as well. We're going to kick this off, Aisha, thank you so much, with a poll question. So, Aisha, if you can kick that off for us, that'd be really appreciated. That would be.
Absolutely. So we do have a poll question to begin the session for our audience members to interact with in real time. And that should be appearing on your screen. So the question we have for you is, are you thinking about a diversity strategy? You can select one of the options displayed on your screen, either yes or no. That question again is, are you thinking about a diversity strategy, And your answer choices are yes or no. So please take a moment to submit your vote for this question. Okay, I see that the votes are coming in. I'm going to give our audience members a couple of more seconds to get in their votes, and then I will close the poll and share the results. Once again, the question that we have for you is, are you thinking about a diversity strategy? And your answer choices are yes or no. Okay, so it looks like the majority of you have voted, so thank you very much for doing so. I'm going to close the poll and share the results. So 88% of our audience responded yes, that they are thinking about a diversity strategy, while 12% responded no. So thank you very much to our audience members for participating in that poll. I'm going to pass back the mic to our speakers.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. Just want to double check that you can indeed see my screen. Just want to double check that. You can still
Yep,
see it?
we can
Perfect.
see your screen. We have a little pop-up that we do see, though, at the bottom.
Okay. Let's have a look.
Perfect.
So what I want to actually start off with is to think about, we've thought a long time, diversity and inclusion in clinical research I always like to ponder about how it's been nice, right? It's a nice to have, been in this industry for a while, and I know many attendees have been in this industry for a while, but it's always been considered nice to have. But now it's changed to a must have. And I've thought as a regulator about, how this self-regulation in our industry has not really worked. So we've got self-regulation in a regulatory environment, but as industry has kind of been left to their own devices, it hasn't worked. Okay, so, and thinking about the FDA's race and ethnicity diversity plan, the guidance that came out, draft guidance about how we want to improve the enrollment of participants, that actually allowed many people to start thinking about that, and also understanding how regulatory agencies are probably pivoting now to we've seen kind of like what industry can do, but now we're getting involved, right? And I've actually welcomed that a lot. I have. And FDA Commissioner Robert Califf, for example, had said, that clinical trials provide a crucial base of evidence and what have you, but it's known that there are biological differences that exist in how people respond to certain therapies as well. There's variations in genetic coding, so these variations can make drugs like antidepressants, for example, and blood pressure medications less effective for certain groups. And I'm using just like, what the FDA have been really clearly outlining, and they've made some fantastic actually improvements and core discussions in industry about what we need to be thinking about. Of course, the FDA is one regulatory agency, so we're thinking about it from a a global sense as well. And this race and ethnicity diversity plan, the guidance that was, of course, like I said, it's been draft guidance as well. And I think the comments were open for industry to respond back. And if anyone has a chance to read the FDA docket and read the over 100 comments that have come through from various industry stakeholders where they're asking for more, actually, rather than less, I actually do think that the FDA, when they're finalizing this guidance, this is going to change and it's going to become more robust. And interestingly, what I noted in the FDA docket comments were that companies and patient advocacy groups, whether it's companies, whether it's CROs or sponsor companies, they're asking, nice to have, you're saying it should be encouraged. We want you to tell us that actually you definitely do require this as well. So it's been quite interesting like that in that sense, for sure. It sparked a whole interest in what is happening in the industry, and it's prompted, like I said, it's prompted sponsor companies to think a lot more further about how you are developing a product, right? So I have a next slide. I'm just going to try to share that out. So what have been the example barriers to participation that, for example, the FDA have rightly outlined for industry? Mistrust of the clinical research system. We all know about the historical abuses and what have you, and we're also thinking about the various recruitment and retention efforts that are undertaken as well. Language and cultural differences, health literacy, religion. I'm going to speak from my example. I'm a Sikh woman of faith, right? And visible faith and what have you, but I've been very dismayed about in my community, whether it's in the UK, US or Canada, about how much our community actually knows about clinical research as well. So how are you getting to those patients? How do we get to those communities? And Sean will kindly be speaking about that a little bit later, but really prompting what has led to we need an aha moment, and then rather than talking about it, which I know sounds ironical that we're actually talking about this, but really getting to true action as well, okay? So I'm going to allow Alison, if you can talk a little bit about your experiences as well, and just direct me about what slide, when to switch onto a slide as well.
Yeah, so despite the advances, which there are some, these statistics you see here are from the most recent FDA snapshot. Progress is slow, right? It's slow and is also quite unbalanced between populations and unbalanced across therapeutic areas as well. People with less means, people who live in rural areas, people of color who are African Americans or Black Americans, Hispanic or Latinas, First Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, all of these very significant swaths of our population continue to be left out of the scientific process. And in oncology in the US, that's particularly evident, where clinical trials and genetic testing favor those with access to things like large academic centers, available finances, social supports, and adequate insurance. So go ahead, Aman, if you can advance from there. Thank you. And unraveling, I mean, this is just a very clear message, unraveling these complexities of access and inclusivity. It requires all of us to be intentional, and it requires continued effort. And I think that's something that you're seeing, especially over the last couple of years with the emergence of COVID. It was certainly quite evident that there was a miss in terms of clinical trial participation with those who are most impacted by the disease, and it was very evident when the data was brought to the attention and to the FDA for review and endorsement, that those who were bearing the most significant burden of COVID were left out of the clinical trial process. And I really do believe that that fostered a lot of the attention and the rapid acceleration of the FDA's the pushing of their guidance, actually, but probably also all of our attention to it as well, where we know it's needed. And as you said, Aman, we've been doing it. We've been dabbling in it, I guess, for a very long period of time, but not really paying as close attention to it as we should, and not being as intentional as we could to it. So it will take time to unravel these complexities, but I think there's a lot of us focused on it now, and I think we have an opportunity to do it. One more slide. So as sponsors, there's many ways that we can influence inclusivity. We need our efforts to be tangible. They need to be measurable. We need to really understand how patients access care. How do they come into the care environment? And what are those barriers? We need to really understand at a very therapeutic and deep level, what is the diagnostic roadmap? Where can we have that influence? We do need to really better understand our role in our relationship with the site, so we can help the site connect to the communities and help the communities connect to the clinical trials. And that does also mean that we need to be thinking about how are we investing in education, in awareness, and in the infrastructure, so that we can support those bridges from the community to the clinical trial centers and to our clinical trials. Thanks, Aman.
Thank you so much, Alison. I know we're going to have lots to discuss, but we wanted to kind of just highlight a few key things that we're always thinking about. And I'm going to ask Sean to step in and talk about the patient journey as well. We all have lots of conversations, we do, right? But it'll be great to knowledge share. Sean, can you jump in for this slide, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So first and foremost, we do understand there are challenges about diversity and inclusion in our clinical research industry, but what are we doing about it? And it all really starts with the study design and the way the protocol is written. Are we writing the protocol in a way that reflects what the study needs are, or are we actually thinking the real world needs are? Are we including everybody that we need to in each and every one of our studies? So it would behoove us to not generalize on the efficacy, safety, and tolerability of our therapeutics to the entire treatable population based on our current study designs. So this is a lot easier said than done. I really get that, because right now there's a lot of mistrust in our industry, especially with diverse cultures. And this makes sense because of a lot of the discriminatory events that have taken place to date. So what are we going to do about that? Well, we need to communicate better, and we need to enhance our outreach approaches. Number one driver in terms of clinical research recruitment is the trust between the patient and the practitioner. So any way we can give them the tools to reach out to the people of their community, we have to support. If we need to translate materials for the audience that's around those research sites and those investigators, we need to do that. Some people talk more in layman's terms than scientific terminology. We have to be sensitive of that. We also need to be welcoming with people at all times and in person whenever possible. Again, we're trying to establish that trust, and the more that we are personable, the more trust that takes place. And last, in terms of communication and outreach approaches, we really need to be sensitive to symbolic colors and gestures that many people live every day. It's the small things that count. I know personally, I get a second, maybe even a third opinion about everything that I do to make sure I'm not offending others to the best of my ability. And personally, I've made mistakes internally, and that's okay. Like it's very important that we discuss with others that we trust, and we educate ourselves, and we humbly drive things forward. And with that approach, I think good things are about to come. And the last area I really wanted to cover is that when we conduct a study, we need to really make sure that we have a complete understanding of the study, not of what the study needs are, but how we impact the patients. How does each study arm impact the patient? They are contributing so much to us when they're being in part of a study, And communication and over communication is going to help maintain that trust that they have in our industry. So that also means after the study. There's been so many cases I know that a patient has gone through a study and then they don't even know what the results were, and that led to some mistrust. So we need to make sure that the beginning to the end is addressed. Also, it's inevitable. We're going to face challenges in study. Every study is novel, and we're going to come across challenges. So we need to address them as soon as possible, and if possible, before they arise. So we need to be committed to the conduct from a patient perspective so that they know that they're valued throughout the whole duration of the study. And last, we need to be sensitive whether the inclusion and exclusion criteria is including diverse communities. Again, I'll tell you from personal experience, when you're excluded from something, that's an indirect way of saying that you're not welcomed. So again, that contributes and funnels into that mistrust as a whole theme. So the more we make our studies real world mindset, and we try to be inclusive as much as we can from a scientific perspective, because again, it's a balance, the better we're going to be practicing. So overall, the key takeaways I really have is this is very layered, it's very complex. Some of these things are big items that we can help, some are small, but don't default that you can deflect some of these issues and think that somebody else is going to pick up the pieces. Everything that you do to contribute is going to be very, very imperative that we practice so we have ultimately a solution for this challenging issue. And I thank you for your commitment.
Thank you so much, Sean. Really appreciate that. So, Jeff, I'm going to ask you to step in. Sean talked about what actually happens in the real world. So what are your thoughts, quick thoughts as well?
Yeah, as usual, Sean stole my thunder, but let me build on some of the themes there. I think, I'm also observing that it's a fascinating and actually, frankly, energizing time that we're all living in right now. We've seen a lot of progressiveness, frankly, more in the last few years at the FDA than I think we've seen in the last, 30 or so. But, dealing with a lot of issues that are really touching each other. Sean, again, brought up the idea of real world. The real world is real important, but the real world is real messy at the same time. So we've got to ensure that our scientific experiments address multiple issues, certainly diversity, but at the same time, we have to make sure that we are constructing and designing good experiments to really determine if the drug works. But does the drug work in diverse populations, I think is really where we need to be. Again, the FDA is thinking a lot about patient centricity, thinking about real world, thinking about patient centricity, thinking about diversity and inclusion. All of these things seem to be, really related. What strikes me is that, again, we need to think about ultimately who's going to be using the drug. And again, it's not a snap of the fingers. There are access issues that will impact who's going to be using the drug. But ultimately, we need to think about more of a real-world population. My points here are that, again, real-world evidence used to be really just focused on post-approval issues. Does the product really work in a real-world environment? Is it cost-effective? Is it of value from the patient standpoint? And increasingly, safety, post-approval safety is important. We're seeing more real-world evidence being used as part of the clinical trial development process, whether as a simulated control, in many ways sometimes replacing the placebo arm, also perhaps as a source for patients. Increasingly, real-world data can be a great opportunity to identify diverse populations. Fundamentally, the concept of the 21st Century Cures Act was really a recognition that information from randomized clinical trials are great, but may not be what clinicians need on a day-to-day basis to make medical decisions. So again, the FDA has thought a lot about real-world evidence, how that can augment clinical trials. It's always struck me that the traditional clinical trial approval process has always been built on controlled experiments that really don't reflect how the products are actually going to be used. So we really have to challenge some of those precepts. And again, think about actual use conditions, think about the diverse populations, while at the same time, again, not messing up the experiment. We do need to control for a lot of issues that that add some noise, unnecessary noise, to the design of a clinical trial. But as you said earlier, Aman, ensuring that we're looking at diverse populations, at different genetic compositions. Again, these are the people that are going to be using the product, so we need to work backwards from there. And again, ultimately, I think if we are embracing a real-world evidence philosophy, that is going to allow us to embrace diversity in many ways at the same time. So this is part and parcel of the clinical trial development program these days, thinking about real-world data, thinking about real-world evidence. And if you're doing that, then almost intrinsically, you're thinking about more diverse populations. So I really see diversity and real-world evidence and patient centricity all coming together in kind of a win-win-win environment. Again, it's not a snap of the fingers that we're going to be able to do everything overnight. There are a number of complex issues that we need to address, but this is an amazing step in the right direction. And again, kudos not only to the FDA, but to our industry in general for embracing these concepts. I was delighted to see that 88% of the people responding are thinking carefully about this. Again, not a snap of the fingers issue, a lot of different complex issues, but we've had some really interesting experiences working with our clients and helping them step through some of these challenges. And that's what I believe. Over to you, Aman.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Yeah, you've raised some really great points about how we're thinking about clinical development, and there's so many different overarching strategies that you need to interweave into your overarching strategy of clinical development of a certain product. So I really appreciate that. I'm now going to we're going to open the floor up for questions, and we're going to have a discussion, because this wasn't just an opportunity where you get to hear ourselves talk, but more so to knowledge share and prompt some questions, because here in the industry we want to really understand what we should be doing. We've talked about it enough. What are we actually doing, and what can an attendee of this webinar, for example, what can they take back as well? So Aisha, I'm going to pass it back to you, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Sounds good. So thank you very much for that very informative discussion, and I'm sure our audience is definitely benefiting from this very important discussion. And we will head into a Q&A session. So I've already received some questions from our audience, and we'll go through those. So do please keep sending in your questions, and we will try to attend to them in this Q&A session. So the first question that I have here that we'll do to kickstart off the Q&A, the question is, I work in a company that is not large and therefore has limited budgets. How can we make a difference?
It's actually a great question.
Yeah.
And I think every single person is going to be able to discuss this. Alison, I'm going to let you come in first.
Yeah, so I similarly work in a small organization, and I think there's a misconception that it takes a lot. It doesn't take a lot, really. I guess my own, because I'm very, dedicated to it, and it's something I feel really strongly benefits the clinical trial and benefits our engagement with sites and ultimately patients. I look at it as this is just something that we have to do. It's not expensive to do outreach to patients or bring a group of patients together and have a conversation about, what's important to them. What we've done at my small company is we've basically just set up ourselves to make sure that we incorporate patient voice from the very beginning. So we have held patient ad boards or patient consultant groups, whatever you want to call them. It's getting a group of patients together and talking with them about how did they get diagnosed? What was it that they struggled with? Who did they struggle with? Were they ever offered clinical trials? If they were, or if they weren't, what were the circumstances of that? Did they undergo diagnostic testing? And if they did, when did that happen? And depending on the clinical trial that you're running, you can develop the sorts of questions that start the conversation flowing and then allow that conversation to evolve based on what those patients are quite interested in. And so I think that's something that we can all do. We can all find patients that we want to talk to. We've also actually taken the step to include our patients on our steering committee so that we can continue to engage with them throughout the life of the study. And I would just share that the importance of moving this from the real world evidence side, so where Jeff works, right, is after the clinical trials are getting through the clinic, maybe moving into phase 3s, and then post-approvals, bring it forward to when you're actually starting your development. And it's interesting what you learn. We've learned from some of our patients that there's toxicities associated, for example, with standard of care that causes neuropathies in their fingers that just simply makes opening a blister pack difficult. So they just ask, can you do something different? Can you repack? Can you package this in a way that doesn't bother our fingers? Now, that's something that's really important, but it can't be addressed sometimes if you wait too long. So having that information before you enter into the clinic is really helpful. And some people do get worried, for example, also about, what are the patients going to say when it comes to changing my study or changing my study design? Those things the feedback doesn't mean that you scrap your study design, kind of what Jeff was kind of saying and Sean was kind of saying. It means that you might modify it to make sure that the questions that you're asking are things that are important to patients. And I always think back and I tell this story, so I'm sorry if you've heard me say it before, if you've ever seen me talk before, but there was a patient for children who were suffering from muscular dystrophy, and the study design was looking at whether the children could lift up a 10-pound weight. And when they talked with the parents of these small children, the parents basically said, we don't care if they can lift a 10-pound weight. We just care if they can pick up a fork to feed themselves. So that's feedback that is very actionable. And you can take that back to your study design and modify it to make sure that you're including things that are important to patients and important to their well-being. So just a couple of examples, but I really would encourage you to talk to patients early and recognize that it really isn't that much of a challenge on the financial end. And there's lots of groups that can help you do that as well.
Yeah, I just add to that again. I don't mean to be glib and cavalier, but you've heard the statement that you can't afford not to do these things. I mean, ultimately, many of us on the call today are working for companies that are developing products that ultimately will hit the marketplace. And again, we're working for businesses that are serving patients, but also are part of our capitalist system. It makes good business sense to ensure that we're thinking about the ultimate users and their conditions for use. If we really want to get maximum patient acceptance, maximum physician acceptance, to have our products become part of the standard of care of the treatment of any particular disease, we've got to think a little bit about that situation and, again, work backwards in many ways to ensure that we're embracing those conditions in the design of our studies. As Allison said, again, it's not easy. There isn't one formula that's going to work. We really have to make sure that we're designing the studies well, but these are different parameters on which we need to design the studies. And I absolutely echo what you said, Allison, about bringing the real world, the concept of the real world in earlier as much as possible. It's, again, something the agency is endorsing, not just in the US, but ex-US as well. The concept of ensuring that we've got good, useful information for patients and physicians at the end of the day, as well as regulatory approval. So very, very exciting. And I think, again, Sean has got all sorts of tricks up his sleeve for how to really ensure that, your development money is well spent.
Yeah, and thank you, Jeff, and thank you, team. I think one thing that I would like to add is a lot of things that we're talking about are very important, very good investments, and they are somewhat in the moderate to long-term investments that we do need to invest in. But what about short-term solutions? And as I was implying, and we've all implied, trust is a major factor. So it comes down to what do we already have in terms of trust between the patient and the physician? And so basically the big picture is we just want to continue having that outreach between the physician and their community and more trust. So I think in terms of what you can do as a small biotech is first you need to, when you do feasibility, try to determine what sites are already practicing a lot of the things that we are. Like, you don't have to recreate the wheel in terms of diversity efforts. And second, what we do at Worldwide is when a site is initiated, we have the conversation that establishes a site-specific recruitment plan. And we add questions about diversity and inclusion to the conversation to make sure that what is it that the site's already doing, and also learning how we can help them. So it could be small, again, back to, it doesn't matter about big or small, it's a collection of good efforts around, and this can be globally interpreted as well. So any way we can help each and every site do better optimal practices, we should consider them.
I'd also push the envelope a little bit, Sean, on the sites that we're targeting. Again, there are classic clinical trial sites that do clinical trials, but there are also practitioners who can get involved in clinical research. They may not be the classic clinical trial sites, but through the support that we can provide them, their access to different diverse populations will allow them to participate in the clinical research paradigm. So I think we've got to start really challenging classic sites, because classic sites, whether they're in academia or quote unquote clinical trialists, may not be where the rubber meets the road when the products are going to be released in the marketplace.
Yeah, Jeff, you just raised a really good point, and I'm sure there's other questions, but that actually is really critical. If you think about how do we support the development of sites, well over 70% of patients get their care not at an academic center, right? So if we are thinking about, where else can we do our studies so that we can reach more patients, we need to be thinking about, are we developing sites outside the typical academic centers where we all run the studies over and over again? And in terms of the long-term perspective, if you're going to do that, it's great to start at the phase 1, phase 2 entry, because by the time you get to your phase 3, that site's going to be experienced. They're going to know what they're doing. They're going to have evolved with you through that development process. You're going to have supported them throughout that effort. And you're going to have a site. You're going to have a site that knows how to now conduct clinical studies and is prepared to do so at the phase 3 level. So I think it's just a really important point that you made. I just wanted to stress that. Thanks.
Really good points. Aisha, any other? I know we've got lots of
we
questions.
do have a lot of questions coming in, so thank you to our audience for that. Let's take a look at another question we have here, and that question is asking, our company is focused on patient recruitment. We've been working on partnerships with minority groups to find different ethnic groups. Do you have any suggestions on getting the word out to groups that haven't typically participated in clinical trials? The person says that I feel it needs to be in a trusted environment.
Great. I can take that first if that's okay. So I'm going to speak, and I alluded to that earlier on in this session as well, looking at how my community, right, South Asian, think about clinical trials, and I watched very carefully the vaccine rollouts in the US, UK, and Canada, simply because I've got relationships and what have you in there. And, a lot of people within clinical research that, for example, from the Sikh community, were quite dismayed, right, about how some things were going. Now, let's take, for example, FDA in previous guidance have said how how you reach out in trusted community settings could be for, say, for example, the Black population in their churches and their barbershops and what have you. Now, when I've spoken to a few people as well, right, they've said, yeah, it works for some people, but that doesn't work for everybody. So don't put us into a box, right? We don't want that. Now, for example, when I noticed many people from the Sikh community, for example, you can't translate, like you can go to churches to go and do this for every single person. Myself, I would find it quite offensive, and I know many other people from my community find it offensive that you have set up kind of like the helicopter research or your awareness that actually occurs before you're going to your place of worship, where you're going to meditate. So trusted environments is a really tricky thing to think about and what have you. So community, and this is the importance when you're thinking about, let's talk about, as an example, you talked about ethnic minorities, the person, that attendee asked a question about that. When you're thinking just about ethnic minorities, you need to have those people in the workforces as well, so that we can remind each other what might be the best way, because we can't just follow an SOP or a kind of playbook, because it's going to depend minority to minority and location to location. So what might work in one location might not necessarily work in another. So that really bringing it back to, how are you engaging the community? So me personally, for example, I've been involved in, we've set up a group, Seeks in Clinical Research, to give awareness, right, to the general population of clinical trials, which, by the way, the group have been surveying places and trying to understand. No one knows about clinical research. And I think, okay, so a responsibility does kind of fall on, community in clinical research to think about, how can we think about educating our parents, our grandparents, our family, friends, and what have you, and what really is the best ways, because I don't want to see kind of research done in my places of worship, but that's my thing. But I know a lot of people that say that, but I go off on a tangent. So really, it's more of a case of listening in to what patients are saying, what they're thinking, what their frustrations have been, because their lenses are what really tells you what actually occurs. Because we kind of sit in our ivory tower of clinical research. This is a way it should be done. But when do we break down those kind of towers as such and start thinking about the true patient experience as well? I'm going to stop because I'm very passionate about this, just like everyone else on this panel. Who wants to jump in?
I'd add a little bit of a different perspective, Aman, and it's, again, we're all on Zoom now, or whatever it's called. So technology is, in general, our friend, I think. Again, there's no absolutes here. There are challenges, but I think what we found is increasingly ensuring that we are looking for authentic channels. And I think about it from a therapeutic standpoint. There are so many advocacy groups that are starting to interact with their patient constituents online. And this isn't just a last few years phenomenon. This has really been happening for the last 20 years. But I've seen more and more organizations starting to tap into these advocacy groups who are giving patients and parents of patients the opportunity to raise their hand and say, yes, I would like to participate in a kinder, gentler clinical trial. Now, again, this doesn't absolutely address the access issues. Access to the internet may not be universal and may indeed be skewed from a minority standpoint. But again, thinking about the authenticity that advocacy groups have with their patient members, I think is another thing that we need to really tap into a lot.
Sean, any comments?
Yeah, I'm going to enhance your point of we need to listen. So it's really good that Allison and you have mentioned, and Jeff, you had good points too, but it was really good to say let's invest in the patient voice. We need to listen. But I want to take another step to that, is that you also mentioned, Aman, that it's not really the same across the board in terms of interpretation. So it's going to be very important to work with advocacy groups. It's very important to identify heroes that's zip code specific, really, to make sure that our notes that we compile from listening, are they accurate to you? And it's we just need to be appreciative that some issues are layered and one size does not fit all, but at least we're doing our due diligence to ask the right questions and educate ourselves better. And I think that that's going to be very, very important if we're going to find an ultimate solution to our challenges.
Alison, any comments?
I mean, I think you're all spot on. I actually think there's value in that, in the attendees already having engaged the communities that they're interested in. And so I would also really just share what you've all said in talking with the people that you're engaging with even presently, and understand, where do they think the gaps are? Where, who are the best people that they should talk to, and are there even informal people? I'm thinking from a change management perspective, with the informal leaders, it's not always the people at the front of the organization. It might be the people who are quiet and at the back of the organization who aren't speaking so loudly, but those might be the people that you need to talk to. And so really, probe the organizations that you're already in touch with, and the sites that you're already in touch with, as you said, Sean, to understand, how do people access that information, what do they care about, and how do we best address it?
I love that. Can you see the diversity of thought that's just come together, and we're just trying to think of practical solutions as well, right, to get that. Aisha, over to you. Next question.
Sure thing. So the next question that we have here is there any data on the impact of nurse navigators in participation of minorities? And if so, what are the strategies?
I don't think I've seen data, Sean. Have you?
I haven't seen any data. I've been seeing a lot of vendors that practices. It's a growing field. It's probably one of the hottest fields in our industry. So that's really, really encouraging. So I think that's the spirit of that initiative is going in the right direction. And I think it's going to be really good that we keep a pulse on seeing if there's any studies and results and return on investment. We know it's in the right direction, but we'll, as everything, once we start an initiative, we keep on optimizing it over time.
Yeah, I'm just going to add too that there's not a lot of data out there on any of these initiatives. I think I've seen one that looked at the direct engagement, and there was some ability to increase awareness, and it lent itself to increased enrollment. And so I think that's maybe, where you see some obviously some, you want, I think I said in the beginning, if we really, what we're doing now, we need to be intentional and we need to measure it, because there's not a lot of data out there about what will work and what won't work. But lots of people are trying, and lots of people are trying to do things that are pragmatic and we believe will break down some issues and challenges for access. So I do think we really all need to be purposeful and write down in our plans, what are we doing, and then revisit that plan and seeing if those things work. And it will be interesting, I think, in the next, 3 to 5 years, as we all evolve in this effort to address inclusivity in our clinical trials and see how we're doing. So, yeah, it's a good question.
Great. Thank you so much for your wonderful answers so far. Let's move on to another question. And that question is, do you think the FDA will ever reject a study because it did not have a diverse patient population?
I'm going to step in and say they could, right? They certainly could, right? Because if a sponsor company is not thinking about, and we started with this, that treatment, that therapy, have you been developing it for that population, that the prevalence is high or there's minimal, we're trying to find out. And I think there will be plenty of warnings, right, before an agency would say outright no, right? You'd have to ignore a lot of agency engagement, I think, right? Whether it is the pre-IND meeting, the end of phase 2 meeting, a pre-NDA meeting, for example, NDA or BLA, you'd have to really ignore it and not think about and heed the advice of what an agency such as the FDA would do. It could happen though, right? I don't know. What does everyone else think?
Don't you think, you do see though, certainly you're seeing them be a lot more thoughtful and critical actually of organizations that are not addressing diversity, in particular with therapeutic areas where the proportion of patients is very inconsistent with the enrollment. I think you're seeing the agency be very critical of sponsors who are bringing data in and with populations that don't reflect the therapeutic indication. So I wouldn't be surprised, Iman. I mean, I don't know if they would outright reject it, but they might put requirements in place, for example, is I guess what I'm thinking, that, that require you as the sponsor to, enroll a percentage of patients that's reflective of the indication. So I'm, yeah, but I'm with you. I think there's a question mark there, but I think we'll see, right? I think we'll get some warnings and continue to have that that feedback and critical feedback.
I think you'll see it. I think again, when the FDA evolved from guidance on real-world evidence to formal guidelines, there were some very specific requirements on the provenance of data, how the quality of data, and if you're going to use real-world data as part of your submission process, the FDA will say no, this just doesn't cut it. So I think as we think about, I think ultimately companies are going to have to demonstrate to the FDA that a diversity and inclusiveness plan doesn't make sense. And I think if you show that there's really no issue, well, maybe it'll pass muster. But I think you're going to have to show that. Again, I think it'll be a lot more acceptable just to embrace it up front. And so that's my thoughts.
And I stress that I think, it's my opinion, we don't know yet, but I definitely get the sense that it's heating up and it's a trend and we cannot ignore it. Now, again, I wish I had a crystal ball that was accurate, but I think with this noise of showing that it's going to be that much more important to include this in our data sets when submitting to the FDA, it'll be a question of if the data is included or if we've shown effort to collect that data. I think that's going to be a major question at the end of the day. I want to channel the energy in terms of that we're doing everything to channel of our effort to get to it. So if we show that we made effort and then we go back to the FDA and say, we're doing all this and it's still coming out with this outcome, that's an easier conversation to have than ignoring the topic altogether.
All right, I think we have time to squeeze in one more question. And this question is, there is a lot of very welcome conversation regarding the necessary work to increase participation of people who occupy racial and ethnic minority groups. What are your thoughts on the required expansion of this to ensure intersectional inclusivity of additional historically underrepresented groups in clinical research, such as the LGBTQ community?
Sean, do you want to take that first? Okay.
Yeah, great question, and I think it gets back to the theme of we need to make sure that we have clear channels and alliances with the advocacy groups and heroes among all those communities, not make assumptions, but do our due diligence to collect and educate ourselves as best as possible and confirm those assumptions. Because I think back in the days when I was not in this industry, but best marketing skills was word of mouth, and that's because of trust and everything else. So it's really good to make broad strokes awareness channels, and that's important. That's a piece of the portfolio. But the more we can drive personal trust channels and connecting all the web diagrams, we really need to be sensitive to that. It's very layered. It's going to take some time to really optimize the efficiencies of this communication channels, but all sectors of diversity cultures, people of color, other diverse backgrounds, LGBTQ, like that was mentioned on the question, we really need heroes from everybody. One size does not fit all.
Completely.
I was just going to ask Sean a question, and actually, it strikes me that more and more companies are hiring chief diversity officers.
Yes.
And in the pharma companies, I wonder if the role of the chief diversity officer is not just internally to make sure there's representation in the company, but to really address some of these issues in clinical research. Are you seeing that?
Definitely, it's a topic. I've been to a couple conferences lately where they're addressing just that, Jeff. It's just one of those. We need to, in order to educate ourselves better, let's invest internally in our company so we can ask questions and deliver on a quality product that is sensitive in nature. However, We are seeing now outreach channels with diversity in mind. And so I think we're all trying to educate ourselves, and having dedicated people educate themselves along with everybody on their team so that we can do this right moving forward. So it'll be interesting to see how the outcome of a lot of these initiatives are, but I personally think it will only be positive.
Yeah, I feel that too. It's only positive, and like we consider we started off, like I started off with the regulatory lens about the race and ethnicity diversity plan with the FDA, right? But when I'm going to draw people back to, if you can have a look to the comments that have been received for that, you'll say, like, we want you to tell us what we need to do for other minorities that you're not thinking about, or how you're saying race and ethnicity. What about the transgender community and other communities and what have you? And even the definitions, some stakeholders have questioned the definitions as well of, okay, the race and ethnicity, actually it's different, right? And bear in mind, I'm thinking about this from the US perspective as well, right? But there's still people saying, well, hang on a minute, what about native indigenous populations as well? They work in a very different way and what have you. And I mean, I'm still thinking about the work that needs to be done to get women in clinical research, right? So we're just trying to get to that level. But yeah, now it's, we really need to be thinking about all the different patients and have them at the seat, at the development seat, right, table.
Good point, Aman. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that the agency put out the requirement that women need to be included in clinical research, right? It seems like that's just always been there, but yeah, you and me, I'm sure, can remember a time when it wasn't. So I don't think the solution to this is, obviously it's not overnight. It really does require us to all be dedicated to it from moving forward. And I think in that collectively the industry is really focused on it at this point. I think that's where we'll see a swell of change, hopefully. But I love what you said about, we just need to be thinking more broadly. We are thinking very U.S. centric, certainly, and the populations within our very enormous country with 370 some million people is very different than other countries in the world and how they think about health equity. But it means that we need to be thinking very carefully about diversity, not only internal to the organizations of which we're part, but the populations that exist that we're trying to reach and make our trials available to. So it's, yeah, really good points, Sean and Jeff and Aman.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to our panelists for that very insightful presentation and discussion. We've now reached the end of the question and answer portion of this webinar. If we couldn't attend to your questions, the team at Worldwide Clinical Trials may follow up with you. In addition, if you have any further questions, you can also direct them to the email addresses displayed on your screen. I'd like to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen. Your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve on our webinars. Now, I'm about to send you a link in your chat box, and you'll be able to view the recording for this event at this link. And you can also share this link with your colleagues when they register for the recording here as well. So I do encourage you to do that. Now, please join us in thanking today's speakers, Aman Kara, Jeff Trotter, Sean Tretna, and Allison Kemner. We hope you found this webinar informative. On behalf of the team here at X-Talks, thank you for joining us. Please take care and bye for now. Bye, everyone. Thank you once again.